Uganda is celebrating 63 years of independence, and happy Independence Day to you all Ugandans wherever you are. And Uganda's 1995 constitution is marking 30 years since it was promulgated. Promulgated on the 8th of October 1995. 8th October 2025 is 30 years, and we've been going through that celebration. And we'll be having the second constitutional conference on the theme Guardians of the Constitution, Strengthening Institutions for Democracy, Justice and the Rule of Law. And the keynote speaker at that conference is a distinguished South African jurist, silk lawyer, before becoming a judge, and ended up at the Constitutional Court of South Africa, but also saw South Africa transition from apartheid to democracy in 1994. I'm privileged to host an interview. Judge Johann Kriegler.
Thank you, and I'm honored to be invited.
My name is Charles Mwangusha Mpagi. Let's start with a bit of your own story. You have a very storied history as a jurist in South Africa. Could I have you do a more proper introduction of yourself to the Ugandan audience?
I was a lawyer and an advocate, a barrister at the Johannesburg Bar for many years. I then became a judge in the local court, then subsequently in the appeal court. And then when the transitional elections were to be held in 1994, the Transitional Council in my country appointed me to chair the Independent Electoral Commission, which launched me on an entirely new career. We conducted the elections. They were a success. I thereafter created a permanent electoral body for the country, which is still functioning satisfactorily. I was then appointed to our first constitutional court, and upon my retirement started a career as an electoral administrator and evaluator and teacher and trainer in somewhere around about 20 countries around the world.
Including Kenya and
Including
Afghanistan.
Kenya, including Uganda once. I was here in, I think, 2006 or 2007 with the International Bar Association. So I've been around.
You've been around. Great. If we could just stay with South Africa for a while, what was it like managing an election at a critical transition period?
It was fascinating. The British would expect one to downplay it. In fact, it was very dramatic. The truth of the matter is that as the 80s developed, political commentators and observers thought that the country was heading for a bloody confrontation. The resistance to apartheid and the imposition of controls by apartheid raised continually. The tension got greater, the violence got greater, and the expectation was something very, very ugly and very, very nasty. We had wise leaders on both sides. The wisdom prevailed.
Are you talking Nelson Mandela and
Nelson
F.W. de
Mandela,
Klerk?
great leader, but not the only one. There were many within the liberation movement, and not only within the ANC, that saw the wisdom of we could rather live together than die together. And on the Republic side, on the South African government side, people like de Klerk saw the writing on the wall, as the ANC saw the writing on the wall. They had 3 years of tough negotiation, which had been preceded by quite a lot of informal discussions. Some of them political, some of them inspired by religious leaders. So at the time when we got to the actual election in April 1994, the ground had been prepared. there was an understanding among South Africans as a whole that this was a necessary rite of transition. We had to go through these national elections of liberation in order to elect a constituent assembly to build a constitution and to be an interim legislature, an interim lower house of parliament. It was a crucial step. It was a vital step. It was a tense step, but the population generally, the electorate, understood the importance that it should succeed. The electoral body had far too little time to prepare. Usually you would need about 2 to 3 years. We had 5 months,
5 months.
actually 4 months. From the beginning of January, when we had our first meeting, until the 27th of April. So it was a mad rush. It was technically, in several respects, flawed. It was administratively, technically, in several instances, flawed. But as a political undertaking, and as this manifestation of the decision of the people to put away their differences and try to take hands with one another, it was a glorious success. There wasn't a single death occasioned on the election or during the days of the election. There wasn't a single death at the time of the inauguration of Nelson Mandela as the new president. The South African Defence Force put on a great show of solidarity and respect for the new president, and to see the SADF helicopters that had been fighting the ANC doing an honorary fly past with the new flags of the new South Africa and having a fly past of aeroplanes was deeply provoking emotion in everybody. And rightly so. It was a national achievement of great proportions. I was privileged to be a mechanic in the process, and I'm deeply grateful to President Mandela, to President de Klerk, the leaders, for making it possible to lead that undertaking.
You led the process in an election whose outcome was pretty predictable. Black South Africans are majority in number, so would you say that was a real contestation that President Mandela went through?
The nationalists, the national government, thought that they would do a great deal better than they did. They thought that they would at least, we have 9 provinces under the new constitution that applied at that stage, and they thought that they would win at least some of those provinces. I think that their own propaganda misled their own leaders. They did worse than they had anticipated. The ANC did worse in KwaZulu-Natal that it thought it would do. In the result, the success of the process was that it did produce a very workable balance in the new interim government. The ANC with a solid majority, not enough, not 2/3 to allow them to predominate the constitution-making process, but big enough to give them far and away the heaviest presence in the Constituent Assembly, the Nationalists having a significant presence, and KZN, KwaZulu-Natal, sending to the Constituent Assembly a majority of Inkatha Freedom Party representatives, the major Zulu ethnic political movement, which meant that everybody was more or less satisfied and everybody was more or less disappointed. I think the major disappointment was the white non-nationalist opposition party that did worse than it thought it had done. It should have done. The party of Helen Suzman, who was the sole voice of white reason in the parliament for a long, long time. Her party did badly.
What would explain that? What would explain that?
I think what explains that is that white majority, white sentiment congealed around the major government force at the time. The Nationalist Party that ran the government had far and away the majority of white votes. And I think a large number of progressive white voters rather voted for the government than voting for the progressive minority party, and possibly a wise decision. You know, when you have one major force, to have a scattered number of little opposition parties doesn't make sense. It makes much more sense to consolidate, because particularly as we had a proportional representation, the electoral system then and still have, every vote counts. It's not as if you've got to vote for people in constituencies and your vote may be useless because the man you voted for or the woman you voted for loses in that constituency. Every vote counts in our system.
1994 to 2025, 31 years down the road for South Africa. When you look back, the foundations that were set, are they still holding?
Let me answer that question this way. Earlier, when in announcing who I was, and you said that South Africa became a democracy in 1994. It became an aspirant democracy. Democracy is not a present that the gods give you, or you go one morning and look under the tree and their Father Christmas has given you democracy. We were given the possibility to build a democracy, and we've been building at it. I don't think we've done particularly well. I don't think we've done particularly badly, but we've sustained a major step towards democracy. The political system is at the moment in a bit of a turmoil, but we'll sort it out. We've got the basic groundwork, the basic rules, the basic roots are there, and we're growing.
Does the ANC, which lost its majority in parliament and has now to lead through a coalition,
yes,
does it feel the same?
I think it's a very healthy move. I think it's. I do believe that if you have a variety of substantial, responsible views within a body politic, within a community, they all should be heard. To have had the ANC with the overbearing presence that it could say yea to anything it liked and nay to anything it liked was not ultimately in the interest of democracy. The fact that it is no longer the biggest dog in the game, or such a big dog that nobody else can bark, has been a healthy change. Whether the coalition is going to work now, I have confidence, yes, and we'll get better at it. Any community gets better at things that they practice to do. Every successful election you have is a step in the right direction. Every successful negotiation that produces a beneficial result is a step in the right direction. We're doing that.
You're in Uganda as keynote speaker at the second Constitutional Conference. The theme is Guardians of the Constitution, Strengthening Institutions for Democracy, Justice and the Rule of Law. This is a constitution we inaugurated in 1995. 30 years down the road, with a lot of amendments, particularly one in the year 2005 when the constitution was 10 years old that removed term limits, and another in 2017 that was a lot more chaotic, had soldiers in our parliament building at its amendment that removed the upper cap on age limit, allowing President Museveni, who's now a candidate, canvassing for votes, to be re-elected, and he'll be costing to 45 years in power. Many people think the Ugandan constitution is no longer holding, that it's been amended so many times that many think its pages that are fundamental have been ripped out, and maybe the country needs to rethink whether it doesn't require to build a completely new constitution. What is your view of this 30-year journey?
I will not presume to try to teach Ugandans how to run their country. That would be impertinent and silly, because I really don't know your politics well enough. What I can say in principle, the less you amend a constitution, the better. In principle, a constitution is a contract between the people with one another and with the entity that they are forming, that these are the rules by which we are going to live together. And you must try to live by those rules. If the rules chafe you in a particular spot, it may not be the rules' fault, it may be your fault. If an aeroplane crashes, it's not because its engine didn't work, it's because the pilot was making mistakes. I would generally recommend to any country that asked me, officially, I would go very carefully into the background, but start off from the proposition that amending constitutions is generally not a good idea. It's a better idea to try to work within what you've got. You know, if you take the American Constitution, there was an amendment passed, I think in 2023, an amendment that had been proposed in 1778. 1778, 2 years after
the birth of the United States of America's democracy.
It was one of the earliest proposed amendments, but there is such a conservative opposition to changing the Constitution in the United States that's the strongest example. There are many others. For instance, to get women on the ballot paper. I think it was 1921 when first they got the vote. And it was only the impact of the First World War and the rise of women in commerce and industry that really finally got that amendment over the barrier. So, and the American Constitution, by and large, has been a good one and has worked well. But they've changed it very little.
Very few times, yes. And the Ugandan Constitution has been changed quite a few times. The Ugandan Constitution has been changed quite a few times in its short life period. But there are people who argue and say, well, that's healthy for the country, that a constitution cannot be static. It needs to move with the times, if I could borrow that.
No, I think that in principle that is also correct, but it is for a society to decide for itself what it does. In principle, I would advise, as I said generally, against ill-considered, hasty amendment to Constitution. You may come to rue it. I don't know whether this country has 2 amendments, of which I'm aware. Those 2 were wise or not. And if I did, I wouldn't express an opinion in public in any event.
Interesting. I'd like to get your experiences. 2007, Kenya goes through an election process. It's chaotic. It's chaotic. Hundreds of people are killed, thousands flee across the border into Uganda, and you are brought into that mix. And you spend 6 months in Kenya, moving into the villages, interviewing people. Yes, out of that chaos, they were able to produce a new constitution. And it appears like, could you share with us your experience from across the border? Our neighbors.
Charles, Kenya in 2007 was reaping the fruits of a very, very long history. That started with the colonial powers, the great British imperialisms that played games with ethnicity in the country, thought that they would promote one grouping as the clerks and the ones that they would send to school, and another lot that they would use in the army and the King's African Rifles, and playing, dividing and ruling in their administration. 2007 showed that had not stopped. The great liberator himself could hold the country together.
You're talking Jomo Kenyatta?
Jomo Kenyatta. But the followers couldn't quite hold the lot together. It's still, once again, the result of the regime that was established in the 60s when Kenya got independence. The election was not overtly run on ethnic lines, but ethnicity undoubtedly plays a major role. And it
was always bubbling under the surface.
It was
and
always
just exploded.
bubbling. And our inquiries made it perfectly clear that what you would do is young gangs of political thugs would ask people in the street to pronounce certain words. And if they could pronounce them this way, this lot would kill them. And if the other thugs got a gang on the other side who couldn't pronounce other words, they would kill them. The violence, antipathy was anticipatable. It had been there before. None of the elections since they went back to multi-party rule after the Moi regime, none of them was violence-free. They got increasingly violent, and the 2007 eruption was a combination of that history and then an unwise political campaign run by a number of the leaders, accentuating the difference instead of looking to say, this is how I can gather us together, this is the leadership that I offer the people. Major suspicion created towards the integrity and the competence of the electoral administrator in advance, even if they had been perfect, which they certainly weren't. Many of the people wouldn't have believed
that they were. They were playing fair.
The credibility of the process had been spoilt in advance. And I have not come across an election anywhere that can survive that kind of run up to it, of major discrediting of the integrity of the process as such. And then when the tension got particularly high at the end of December 2007, there were a number of major mistakes made. Mistakes made by the electoral administration, by the government of the day, by the international observer community, and this created set a spark in the already inflammable atmosphere that was there. And it was seen on national television. And here is one of the bitter ironies. Democracy is about the people being aware of what is happening, people being aware of their responsibility to control it, being the source of the power. And the image that was created on national television of the events at the National
Electoral Commission
Centre
headquarters.
created an impression in the minds of already poisoned minds of millions of Kenyans. Look at it. You can see it's
in
a
black
mess.
and white.
The executive says a mess, and the electoral commissioner chair says it's a mess, and the chair of the International Observer Group says there was skullduggery in this constituency. Oh, it has happened. This is the spark, and the people that I would talk to out way Lodwar,
That's fine to the northwest.
way
of
out
Kenya.
in the north, 1,000 kilometers from
Nairobi.
Nairobi. They knew what had happened that night. They knew because they'd seen things on the television that had improved their own view of what they had thought in advance. Their prejudices were fed, and the result was a disaster. I believe that the figures, to this day, I believe the figures were understated. It was not only the 1,200 odd that were killed, 300,000 of whom many tens of thousands to this very day have not returned to their homes. It left a wound of which the Kenyan community is still aware.
And they haven't overcome, certainly. And when you see what's going on now, from ICC indictments and the ICC vacating those indictments, and up to now, some of those players are in government. But the sad thing is that the victims, the vast majority of the victims, are ordinary people, the poor in those slums of Mathare, Muthaiga, and others that end up suffering more than others. The ruling class somehow is able to shield itself and remain together in the high places. And but we need to take a quick commercial break, and I need you to catch your breath. But when we come back, we'd like to look at the broader spectrum of this attempt at democracy, especially on the African continent.
Yes.
Does it actually work? There are many people saying, no, we don't need to model democracy in Africa on what happens in Europe, what happens in the United States. We need to find a formula that works for these communities. I'd like to get your views on that.
We will talk about that after the break.
Thank you.
Digital rights are those human rights and legal rights that allow individuals to access, use, create and publish digital media, or to access and use computers, other electronic devices and telecommunication networks. Digital rights include a right to freedom of expression, information and communication through technology, a right to privacy and data protection, a right to credit for personal works, a right to universal and equal digital access, a right to identity, a right to anonymity, a right to be forgotten, and a right for protection of minors, among others. The state's digital rights are frequently violated through various unfair actions, for example, blockage of websites and social networks, theft of credentials, unauthorized use of people's data for personal gain, privacy intrusion, online censorship, arrests and intimidation of online users, internet blockages, and the proliferation of laws and regulations that undermine the potential of technology to drive social, economic, and political development worldwide. It is hence every citizen's responsibility to respect rights of other digital users and to speak out or report to the responsible parties when one's rights are violated.
We're still celebrating 63 years of independence, or since Uganda gained independence from the British, and 30 years of the 1995 Constitution. I'm privileged to be interviewing Judge Johann Kriegler. He is a distinguished South African jurist. Was on the bench, was on the bar, served on the bar, served on the bench, and yes, a silk lawyer is a king's lawyer. But at
Yes.
the time you started, you were the queen's lawyer.
Yeah,
That's what they'll call you.
That's right. When I started, although we didn't use the royal titles any longer because we were a republic, we were just senior council.
Senior counsel.
SC, not QC or KC.
Very nice to have you. And you're the the keynote speaker at the second constitutional conference for Uganda on the theme Guardians of the Constitution, Strengthening Institutions for Democracy, Justice, and the Rule of Law. I was putting a question on the victims of this political contestation. The majority, and Kenya is a good example. Uganda has seen one from emerging after independence, a series of constitutional crises that went through. Civil war, the most ugly one running from 1981 until 1986, that brought President Yoweri Museveni to power. Then you go through a making of a new constitution that was inaugurated in 1995. Took a long time. The distinguished judge, he became a judge, he became Chief Justice of Uganda, leading a constitutional commission, went around the country, collected views from Ugandans, created a document that many Ugandans then celebrated as a document that, number one, represented the views and aspirations of the people of Uganda. Ushered in a return to elective democracy. 1995 to 2006. By the time you go 2006, you began tinkering a little bit with the constitution, remove term limits. And people are arguing and saying, you haven't tested them. You don't know how they work or they don't work. A few years down the road, you again in the constitution and making amendments. You're saying, no, these are not anchored. The amendment process can only be done in parliament. And some people are arguing, no, we should have gone back to the population through referenda, ask whether we want to make these changes or not. Now, 30 years down the road, we are in full-blown election season in Uganda. Candidates are traversing the countryside. You have 7 candidates that have been nominated by the Electoral Commission, Electoral Body. Some of them were crying yesterday they don't have enough money to sustain the search for votes. But many people, in many respects, still think that the outcome is predictable. I did put a question to you. 1994, South Africa, the outcome was, in a sense, predictable. Nelson Mandela will be elected and black majority rule will take over after years of white minority rule. Kenya, unpredictable, but they had from independence, transition from Jomo Kenyatta to Arap Moi, and then Arap Moi, 25 years down the road, 25 years down the road, he's got to leave power, someone else is taking over, 2007, it blows up. This experiment of democracy through elections, especially for the African continent, is it a worthwhile journey? Would you say?
Yeah. What do I say? My question to you is, what do you suggest as the alternative? What is the alternative to democracy?
Are we ticking a box by going through electoral processes? Some people argue that this is just a ticking of the box, not really a representation.
Give me one example. Give me one example of a dictatorship that has worked for the interests of the people. Well, if you give me one good example, I'll concede a good deal of your argument.
Some people would argue and say, go to Cuba under Fidel Castro.
Oh, really? Mm-hmm. Go and ask the Cubans. Go and see what the country looks like. Go and see what the reality is, not the academic theory or the ideologically poisoned propaganda, but the reality of the people in the streets of Havana, and see what they look like and ask them whether they liked it so much.
Would you give me another example of a democracy really that has kind of functioned? I'll give an example. Just before the fall of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, he'd won his election with over 90%. Just before the fall of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt.
Yes.
And the Egyptian revolution that we're still looking at, he'd won overwhelmingly. You can go to Tunisia. The
Yes.
leadership there was winning. You can go to Syria.
Yes.
The leadership was winning elections. Electorally,
Winning,
when they ticking a box
yes,
to say, we go through our democracy through an electoral process. Now, whether that electoral process actually represents the wishes and aspirations of the people is a different matter.
let's take them one by one. Do you suggest that that Egypt, under the current regime, is better off than it was under Hosni Mubarak? Do you suggest that Syria and the civil war that followed the fall of Assad was better than Assad?
You tell me.
I'm saying to you that the democracies as they were, as patently defective as they were in those two countries, were still better than the alternative. That's all I claim for democracy, is that it's the best of a lot of bad systems. If you can come up with a better one, I do believe theoretically that if you made me the dictator of South Africa, I would be much better than Ramaphosa and the whole democratic system and the parliament of 400 members, because I'm wise and I've been around and I know the answers. Of course, that's nonsense. I can never represent the views and the wisdoms and the impressions and the aspirations of the people, such as my defective democracy can do and does do at the moment.
There's an election going on in Cameroon. Paul Biya is still
Yes.
a candidate.
Yes.
His daughter says he shouldn't be elected, but he's likely to win.
Of course, there are military dictatorships which go through the motions of democracy. They aren't really democratic at all, where the rules are changed and the voters' roll is skewed and the army exerts pressure. Those are sham democracies. They're not even trying to be democracies. The ones where they actually do have a rethink, as they did in Kenya, as they did here, as they did in my country, deserve to be given a chance to prove that they can work, notwithstanding their faults, because they're better than what was there before. And it is no certainty that what will happen if you get rid of them will be any better than what it used to be in the past. It's just, Charles, we are talking about human institutions. We are talking about institutions run by fallible human beings who make mistakes and who have prejudices and who have sinful interests and dishonesty. We know better than we have to be. And we have to be better because the Constitution says you've got to behave in a certain way. And that's what I propose as a sincere, experienced, fairly cynical human rights lawyer. Democracy may not work, but darn it, it works better than anything else.
What would you recommend if you're speaking to the chair of the Ugandan Electoral Commission to say you're running an election, this is the 7th election which President Museveni is participating in, and yes, from 2006 to 2025, the 4th election under multi-party democracy. What would it take to walk out of this election and say, yes, the election has happened, the result it has given us is what it has given us, but to say we are moving on that journey towards strengthening elections, for example, if I can call elections as an institution for farming our democracy, farming justice and rule of law, this is what we need to look at as the benchmarks. If you're scoring yourself as an electoral commission, this is what you look at. What would you say to that?
I'm not sure that that's the function of the Electoral Commission. The Electoral Commission is an agency that has got to do a particular job that is determined by a set of rules and a set of laws and a set of principles determined by the people. So if you've got to change that system, I wouldn't start with the Electoral Commission. I would start by going to the people and asking them what they think. I have never had such a mandate. I did have a pathologist's mandate in Kenya. I wasn't asked to say beforehand how they must do it. I was asked to come and say what went wrong and what can we try to prevent in the future. That's a different proposition. I wouldn't dream of trying to predict rules for a country where I have not had a thorough, grounded learning experience of that community.
Are you suggesting, therefore, Judge, that every community, in this case, every country, should evolve by its own complexities, by its own systems?
Yes. I think everybody, every community must indigenize the principles of every citizen has an equal right with every other citizen to determine the rules of their interaction with one another. Yes. You may do it this way, we may do it that way. The system, if it breaks down, may need different remedies. I really cannot determine that for a married couple unless I have gone into the interaction between them and been able to determine what it is that is wrong and what is right and what they can change. In the case of a country, it's obviously infinitely more complex than that because you're dealing with the interests of a much wider variety and much more varied community at large. I'm not trying to be evasive. I'm trying to emphasize that it is an exercise that you have to do based on the particular facts of each situation. Let me go to countries that I understand fairly well. I have Eswatini on the one side and Botswana on the other side. To give, and I have been asked to give on occasion, constitutional legal advice in those two countries. It differs day by night because they're two totally different societies with total backgrounds, different societal structures at the moment. I am not a student of any kind of your makeup.
Well,
if and when I were to be invited, I would probably say no, thank you. but if I did,
Eswatini is a monarchy. Botswana is a democracy. Worlds apart.
Botswana is a democracy. Botswana is a democracy of a kind also. It also has a very dominant, particular elite that is pretty sure of being changing powers with one another. The people out there.
If you walked on the streets of Kampala,
yes,
after your lecture, and did an interview randomly with people who understand what's been going on, who follow events outside of Uganda, they would hold Botswana as a gold standard for democracy, especially electoral democracy.
Yes.
Then they'll jump to Ghana and say Ghana is the gold standard.
Yes, and you know, today, I'm glad you mentioned Ghana, because Ghana started as the first really exemplary emerging black democracy under Nkrumah, the first great leader, and proved such a desperate disappointment very soon thereafter. and it went through an era of grave disappointment for us human rights lawyers watching it.
Nkrumah was chest
But
out.
it's working now.
Yes.
It's working now at last, and it's working beautifully, where there's a peaceful change of transition of power, an electoral commission that has the highest possible reputation, a judiciary that is functioning, where you can actually get rid of a senior judge, and it causes a ripple, but the process closes ranks and it carries on in its functions. Ghana is as good an example of what happens when things go wrong and then go right under an emerging democracy. God willing, they'll be even better and they'll be even more exemplary than they are at the moment.
You asked me for an example of a country that's not a democracy, but is functioning. And most of Africa has been looking, actually most of the world has been looking to the Chinese model.
Sorry?
The Chinese model. The Communist Party decides who becomes leader. And now they're saying the contestation between what the West has prescribed as universal standards for democracy, hold elections regularly.
I don't believe it's invented by the West. I don't buy that.
Largely, it's been largely propagated by the West, at least in the interpretation of political actors on this, on the vast majority of African, especially Black African countries. They're saying this is a prescription of the West, Western model of democracy. I think that's what they call it.
Yes.
But with
who's the they who say that?
Pardon?
Who are the they who say that?
You come to Kampala, where you are now.
Okay.
Go across to Nairobi, where you were in 2007. Go down to Tanzania.
It's people who are disgruntled with the process. Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And they're saying, look, China has emerged. It's beaten off its poverty. It's now the second world's biggest economy.
Yes.
There's contestation on those numbers. Some people think it is actually the world's biggest economy, or almost running at par with the Americans. And they're saying, to hell with what we see with the Western prescription.
Yes.
And that's why many people have been celebrating Donald Trump. And they're saying, Donald Trump is actually showing us that we don't need to have that universal standard. We do things our way.
Yeah, I don't happen to be a superficial discussant that you ask in the pub or in the street. I realize that the system in China could never ever work for me or for people who think like I do, who think that each and every human being is created with a particular dignity and quality which is inalienable. If you could work under a system such as the Chinese do, good luck to you, but don't try to impose it on me. If you say democracy as we know it is a Western construct, well, ask the Japanese whether it works or not. Ask the Koreans whether it works or not. Ask the Bangladeshis if it works or not. Ask the biggest democracy in the world, India, whether it works or not. India, which is what, 2 billion people today?
1.5, closing 1.6?
Far and away the biggest democracy. It's a bumblebee that should not be able to fly, and it has flown ever since its independence in the 40s, because it's a democracy. They did away with all of the little principalities where you had the little dictators who decided for everybody else. And of course it has faults. And of course you have riots. And of course you have racism. And of course Moti plays the ethnic card when it suits him. But, hey man, it works. It struggles along, but it works.
It hobbles on.
It may be a wounded elephant, but it's walking.
It's working. Thank you very much. We're just coming to the end. We need to wrap this up in a few minutes. I'd like, for the benefit of the people watching you on this interview on Civic Space TV, Uganda at this very critical moment, after 40 years of President Yoweri Museveni, he'll probably be added another 5 years, if he gets another 5 years. The country will be moving towards a transitional process, but it has experienced a lot of fragility, especially around election times. Particularly 2011, immediately after the election, you have a lot of chaos. I could take you back to 1980. Attempt to do an election, it ends up in a civil war for 5 years. Then you come and you go through a reconstruction process of a country. 9 years of dictatorship under Idi Amin, then a short transitional period, collapse into civil war. You emerge out of that civil war, you begin to rebuild where we're having this constitution that we're celebrating now. But then you have a lot of turbulence along the way. 2011 was particularly chaotic, post-election. 2021, 10 years later, chaotic. Now we have another election. What would you say to the players in this whole mix? Incumbent President Yoweri Museveni and his ruling NRM party. The opposition, you have a National Unity Platform, NUP, of a young man, former musician who has emerged as a major contestant. You have a comrade in arms with President Yoweri Museveni, who became his major opponent, his former personal doctor, Dr. Kizza Besigye, who is incarcerated on charges of treason. He's almost making a year in prison. And there are other players that are currently looking for the vote. What would you say to them? To that mix of Ugandans?
I will say to them, Charles, come and listen to me tomorrow. I will think about the question that you have posed, and to the extent that there is an answer, I will try to give it tomorrow. I have not got the answer as I sit here.
What would you say to the chairman of the Electoral Commission?
I will say to the chairman of the Electoral Commission, you've got a job to do. Just do that job. The politics of the exercise are not for you to determine. That's for the politicians and the body politic to determine.
Just another last one. You talked about the South African Defense Forces doing a parade after Nelson Mandela was elected president of South Africa, first black president after years of apartheid. The role of the security agencies, particularly the military, the police, at a time like this?
That question I would gladly answer.
Go ahead.
The South African military at the time of the late 80s was certainly the strongest on the continent in Africa. It could have defeated anything that the ANC put up against them. The question was asked, however, by one of the generals of his colleagues. And so we have defeated the ANC, we have the country bathed in blood. What do we do? Where do we go? What have we achieved? And the penny dropped. That's not an alternative that you ever want. You've got to look for a viable alternative. And the South African military, with which I had a connection by birth and by early occupation, to my great pride said, we shall serve the country, not our own interests. And that's an oath that a soldier takes to himself, whether he takes it officially or not. I will do my duty by the country, and that's what they did. We could not have run the election without the support, the active support of the South African Defence Force. That's my message to any soldier anywhere, is do your duty to your country, not to a regime.
Judge Johann Kriegler, been a pleasure to host you and to interview you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Are we off camera now?
And I hope you enjoy your time in Uganda. It's a beautiful country. Thank you. Very nice to have you. Thank you very much. That's been Judge Johann Kriegler, a distinguished South African jurist. He served on the Constitutional Court of South Africa, served as a judge in the Transvaal, was it? And served as a lawyer, and has also been a distinguished player in election processes across the world. He said over 20 countries. My name is Charles Mwangusha Mpagi.